You know, to get into kind of the Anita Lee life story, and if we were to reduce your whole life to one line, it always comes up as the producer of Stories We Tell, which is really interesting. And of course, that's, it makes sense because Stories We Tell was huge. It traveled around the world. It was a big hit. But I don't feel like that is very indicative or characteristic of the Anita Lee career, arc. So, talk to me about how you feel about being represented by that as a one-liner.
Okay, sure. Obviously it's a film that I'm very, very proud of, a film that I produced with Sarah Pauly, Stories We Tell at the National Film Board. I think it's less maybe reflective of a whole career, but definitely it was a combination of, I think, my creative journey as a producer. So when I first joined the National Film Board of Canada, prior to, I was really somebody who worked in fiction primarily. And so I didn't really kind of move into documentary until I actually started out as a producer. And so a lot of my work, if you actually see earlier, really, I really explore the cross-section between fiction and documentary. I call it creative nonfiction. So there were a lot of other works prior to Stories We Tell where I was really dabbling in that space. And so Stories We Tell at that time, was a project that Sarah came to me at the NFB. We had a mutual friend. I had produced Proteus by John Grayson. Sarah had starred in a previous film of his. And she came to me with a concept for Stories We Tell. And so it's a project where, unlike perhaps some other projects that may have been co-productions or, at a different stage, it was really one where Sarah and I, the cinematographer, and Mike Munn, a fantastic editor, worked together for many, many years to realize that film. So, one, again, that I'm very proud of, but I think it really spoke to my sort of early beginnings working in fiction and then moving into documentary.
Well, then, so going from there, though, like when I look at then the proper IMDb credits, and like a lot of titles jump out at me, like What Walla Wants, The Apology, and most recently To Kill a Tiger. And, these are stories that, for us as Canadians are always touching on our stories in another country, on our roots, right? And so is that much more exemplary of, the type of storytelling you are always pursuing?
It's definitely, I think, as, Canadians of a racialized background or as, from the diaspora, obviously we trace our cultural heritage to so many different parts of the world. And I think in many ways, not only is that reflective of so many Canadians, but also especially here in Toronto. And I think, it really reflects how Canadian cultural institutions, the NFB included, I think really struggled with this notion of, what is a Canadian story for a very, very long time. Sometimes it was defined, a Canadian story was something that took place in Canada, for example. And so I think that, in many of the diasporic communities, we really struggled also to really fight for funding to tell stories that were, more international in nature. And I think it was also something that I really advocated for within the National Film Board when I came in. At the time I started, it was very much a Canadian story, was one that actually took place in Canada. It's hard to imagine that, that definition could be so simple, but that was the reality at the time when I began. And I think by the time I left the NFB, that definition had changed to say a Canadian story was a story that was told by a Canadian filmmaker. And I think it was really that shift, which was really quite a struggle, I would say, was not an easy one. But, every one of those films that you named, it was not an easy green light. I had to have that conversation in many spaces across the organization to get a green light for those projects. And so something that, I feel, is really reflective, I think, of where we are right now in terms of Canadian storytelling and how we define that.
Well, then can we go and get a little bit of the Anita Lee origin story, go back in time? Like, as I understand, you were born in Seoul, you immigrated through Buenos Aires to Canada, and so what was that experience? How does that define the type of storytelling that you wanted to commit yourself to?
Yeah, they always say, how your sort of family story defines you in so many ways, and whether or not that's fact or fiction, and I think this is where my interest has always come from. I've always been very interested in that idea about how the stories that you believe about yourself really start to define you, and not only do those stories, reflect your reality, but often begin to shape your reality, as well. And I think for me, I have a very sort of family origin story, which is both my parents are from Northern Korea, and so they both escaped to South Korea as children. And so most of my family on my father's side are still in North Korea today. And I think that was part of the reason why we left South Korea also at that time after the war, because my parents also did not have that same affinity to South Korea in the same way. And I think part of going to Buenos Aires was also, looking for this sort of place of belonging, right? This kind of other homeland that you could find. And we ended up here, of course, in Toronto. And it's been a long journey, but I think that sort of notion of, what is a homeland and where do you belong, And I think that history that I have in my family has always, put me in a position where I was always very interested in sort of a larger notion of connection and trying to find identity and connection across cultures and across communities. And that, that notion of home is something that can be much more complex and abstract. And ultimately, I think, a sense of belonging, which is what we all look for.
Well, when you talk about trying to capture a sense of culture or connection across cultures in your storytelling, and let's say, one of the earliest credits I see is, you worked as second assistant director on Helen Lee's Prey, which is a 1995 short film, about half an hour short film, stars Sandra Oh and Adam Beach, where Sandra Oh, really fun premise. I should have called you up and said, do you have a copy of this? Because I can't find it online. But it's, Sandra Oh plays a woman whose family owns a convenience store, and she is, it's a really sexy premise where she's attracted to the guy who robs her family's convenience store. Talk to me about, what was, the experience of telling that story, putting that, working on that set? What was kind of the defining experience of being part of that production?
That's such a interesting time, and I would share. I think that was my first production credit. So this is Prey by Helen Lee, who is still a very close friend and someone who is a seminal Canadian filmmaker. In that, I do believe she was probably the first Korean-Canadian filmmaker to make films here in Canada. She also made an experimental short film called Sally's Beauty Spot, which to this day is studied across universities in feminist filmmaking programs. But Helen and I were, friends at that time. She was invited to be in the Canadian Film Centre Director's Lab, and that was a CFC short film. And at that time, Sandra Oh was also not at all the household name that she was today, nor was Adam Beach. And I think that, as early as then, we were really interested in this sort of, cross-cultural intersection and identity, and I think that Helen chose those two characters, one being a Korean-Canadian female and another character being an Indigenous male, very, very symbolically and intentionally. But, at the same time, I think it really, really showed that the industry was in a very, very different place. And in many ways, I feel like that story was ahead of its time, and I feel like if that story was written today, there would be a very different kind of distribution and audience for it. But I think those were sort of early isolated cases where we were trying to tell those stories, but the environment was not ready.
When you just said that, you said that Helen was part of the CFC Directors Lab at that time. That was part of, then, that would put her in sort of the same cohort as, say, Clement Virgo and Mina Shum and stuff, right? Because they all kind of came through the CFC through a sort of an initiative for diversity at that time, am I right?
Yes, I think Helen was a little bit earlier, and I think because Clement then made Rude, which was a feature, which was part of the feature film project, but this was actually their shorts program.
Okay. So then, let's jump ahead to 1997. This is a period where Mina Shum, now her second film, what's called Drive, She Said. Right, that's coming out. Adam McGowan's Sweet Hereafter is the big Canadian story. Hayao Miyazaki's movie Princess Mononoke, that just opened in Japan. It's going to be a couple years before it comes to Toronto. So there's not a huge Asian filmmaking scene yet here in Canada. And that's when you found Real Asian. So talk to me about kind of the impetus of creating that in that moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of you that may be the same generation as myself would remember, there was this sort of time in the mid-90s where there's, I would say, like a first wave of sort of culture and identity politics that really surfaced in North America, I think, and really impacted the film and media space. And many of us were involved in a lot of organizations at that time. So very much like right now where we have, ISO and BSO and all of these wonderful organizations that have sort of come forward. That was at a time as well where there was, sort of what I would call legacy organizations at the time. And in the film festival space, there was, Images Film Festival, but there were also various other, I would say, kind of organizing that was happening. And it was really a time where I think there was a lot of tensions actually in terms of sharing space. And when I look back, in these artist-run centers, they were already so just not adequately supported, and suddenly when a racialized group of filmmakers came forward to say, we really feel like, we too should also have this piece of the pie, at that time it really was not welcomed. And so in some ways, similar conversations that we're having today, we were having then. And, Real Asian for me was really the impetus at that time was because we had actually been doing a lot of this activist work in organizations. Many people were really tired and burnt out. And I think all of us thought, instead of putting a lot of energy at that time trying to change organizations that existed, why don't we actually go and create an organization of our own? And, and some of those early board members when I started Real Asian will to this day say, I lied to them and said, I really need you as a board member, but there won't be any board meetings, I promise. You won't have to do any work. And I sort of, coerced them that way. But that was really the context in when Real Asian came about.
Coercing people by saying, don't do any work. the recipe to success. Well, at that time as well, like, I think so, like, Real Asian pops up in '97, Reelworld just a couple years after, and that's part of, I guess, one of those organizations you said that all popped up. Was there ever, like you said, everyone's kind of fighting for space. Was there ever sort of crabs in the bucket mentality where you're all kind of like in competition with each other, or was it more of a collaborative spirit among these?
Yeah, my sense at that time, I think, because very much like now, it was a case where I think we were responding to a specific context. It felt like various other communities of filmmakers were thinking the same way that we were, and I look back then, Real Asian came about at that time, Desh Pardesh existed at that time, no longer does. They did a lot of South Asian programming, Reelworld, of course, Imaginative. So I think there really was a sense of, a bit of a movement that was happening at that time. And I think there was a sense of solidarity that this is what we were doing.
Was there like a bigger vision though? Because at that time, it's '97. TIFF is not the beast that it is now. It wasn't anything close to I think a lot of people track like '99 when the year that American Beauty won People's Choice. That's when all of a sudden TIFF turned into like the awards monster. But what was then the vision for Real Asian at the time in '97 when TIFF had only gotten so far itself?
Right. I think that there was a lot of, I would say, sort of more critical Asian art-based work that was happening in artist-run centers and more, sort of experimental spaces. But there was really not what I would consider sort of more mainstream Asian American filmmaking that had really, established itself in any way. And 1997 was really pivotal for two reasons. I'm not quite sure exactly why, but in the US, there was this amazing bumper crop of Asian American feature films that were produced that year. And so, people like Justin Lin, of course, of the huge Fast and Furious franchise and Star Trek, made his first film called Shopping for Fangs. There was another film, Yellow. There was Strawberry Fields by Ria Tajiri. So there, Giant Robot by Eric Nakamura. So these were films that were, independent, but I would say mainstream in its craft and really, really fresh. And that was happening at the same time that Canada announced something called Canada's Year of Asia Pacific. And they basically said, if you've got some kind of concept or proposal, we'll give you $5,000, right? And so at that time, I remember Andrew's son, who was actually a journalist at Now Magazine at that time. And I don't know what Andrew and I were doing that day, but I said to Andrew, okay, why don't we apply for this money? And if we get this $5,000, I think we should start an Asian Film Festival. I'll backtrack a little bit. I think it was actually because I had made a short film, and we went to a Asian American Film Festival or showcase in Chicago. I do not recall now why Andrew came with me. And we met, at that time, Justin Lin, he was there with his, Shopping for Fangs at that time. Nobody had seen it. Various other filmmakers. And we just, I think, really saw the need for really a network more than anything, in a support network. And out of that same process, I ended up going to an Asian American Film Festival in San Francisco that year. And I also really, really saw how that film festival served as not only a cultural hub, but a real professional development network for the community. And so it was all of those things that kind of came together. And we did get the $5,000. Can
you imagine starting a festival with $5,000? Well, okay, so then, so you start Reelation. Now let's talk about, your transition into NFB then, right? Because, and as you already said, you said that, a lot of the stories that I know of, or that I kind of, used to define the Anita Lee story at NFB in terms of what you produced, like, you said they were a struggle to get made, or to argue for, to fight for the space for those stories. Well, what about, like, because you also, you infamously started or shepherded the VR doc lab at NFB, right? So, and so, like, I mean, your kind of work in interactive and VR documentaries, that gives way to a story like High Rise, which takes people into Rexdale and introduces people to the community there. What was the one about the prison?
Deeper They Bury Me.
Yeah, so it's taking people into, like, kind of the prison space, and I feel like kind of really confronting the reality of carceral punishment. So real intent when you're both exploring new technologies, but also anchoring them with some real intent and purpose and stuff. So talk to me about bringing that, like, first of all, what motivated going into those spaces?
Okay. Yeah, it's also kind of an interesting story, but when I first started at the NFB, some people might recall, I produced a interactive fiction film called Late Fragment with Anna Serrano, right, who is currently the president at OCADU at that time, Chief Digital Officer at the CFC Media Lab. That was my first introduction to interactive storytelling, and kind of a mind-boggling experience for 2 years. Moving out of that, and it ties a little bit back to Stories Retell, I have always really been interested in form and playing with form. And so after that, I also made a 3D film, actually, with Jeffrey St. Jules, Let the Daylight into the Swamp. So I had done a series of sort of, iPhone type, well, iPhone, but mobile films at that time. And so a lot of the experimentation that I was originally doing with form on the film side, I think moved more into the interactive and ultimately the VR space. And it really was, there was a very clear kind of mission at the NFB at that time to explore creative new technology and tie that to storytelling. So that was something that I really embraced because it was a space that I was interested in. And I think it's the space where I think, in a way, my two areas of interest, and I think, in the same way that when you talk about sort of stories we tell and apology, or in that space, a project like Draw Me Close, Jordan Tannenhill, and it's a VR story about Jordan's own storytelling as relates to his mother, who is going through a very serious illness, or Randa Okita's Book of Distance, which was the last VR project I actually did before I left the NFB, which is Randa Okita as a third-generation Japanese-Canadian, looking at the story of redress here in Canada and his grandfather's story. I think it's where I was really able to kind of bring together, I think, ultimately, creative nonfiction and very personal storytelling, and then using technology to bring the viewer through a very immersive experience. So it was a time of real creative exploration that was, very, very interesting for me.
Well, so then if you look at your whole career, let's say at the NFB, in terms of the movies you produced and stuff, like going, VR and narrative, what was the one that you would say you had to put up like the biggest fight for? Like the biggest challenge to get made?
Definitely, as I mentioned, I feel like it was the international stories, that I really needed to position how those international stories connected to us, both as the Canadian industry, Canadian storytellers, and ultimately Canadian audiences, And so, I won't necessarily name one per se, but I'll go a little bit about it. But everything from, you mentioned To Kill a Tiger, right? Because that story by Nisha Pajua right now, which is, really doing fantastically, and I know that they are starting a huge campaign around it, is a story that takes place about a young girl in India facing, just a really traumatic situation. Or Tiffany Shung's The Apology, which looks at Korean comfort women who, who are advocating now for an apology after what they experienced during World War II. Everything to Stateless, co-produced by Jennifer Holness, who I know is doing something here at the summit, which is looking at the relationship of a Central American, Haiti specifically, to, other sort of experiences for that particular community. But I think that, for me, what was really, really clear is that all of the filmmakers making these films had a very personal connection to the story that they were telling. Whether it was actually a direct family connection, or whether it was, stories that they were very, very connected and deeply passionate about because of their lived experience. And so, I think it was really making a case for that kind of filmmaking, at the National Film Board, that, at times were a struggle, and I also understood why it was, because any institution, does need to have a programming frame, does need to have policies, does need to, especially as a public funder, you receive public funding for a particular kind of mandate. So for me, it's less about the NFP per se. I think it's really the evolution of, both the Canadian industry, Canadian institutions, and culture, and for all of us to actually understand, as we move forward, becoming increasingly more a diverse society, right? Again, I think, what does it actually mean to be Canadian, and what are Canadian stories?
Well, so what's interesting to me is, like, you're in these spaces and you're challenging the definition of what are Canadian stories in these institutions. And, you talked about like being in different, like at some point you were on the board of the Images Festival, and then you're like, you move through the NFB, and then you come to TIFF. And I'm thinking of like BIPOC voices in institutions. And I mean, like right now, I think a lot of us know there's a big story going on in media where, we're talking about Israel-Palestine, and you see how that conversation cuts across color lines, right? Where you see certain biases, and you see how different people take a different stance depending on where they're from and the communities they represent. And a lot of times the people, like it was like all of these organizations, they wanted to diversify in response to 2020, and they propped up all of the, you see it at the NDP party, they propped up these people of color to show off how diverse they are. But then when we get to the conversation, all of a sudden those voices are being silenced. And it makes me wonder, can we truly, fight for space in these institutions, or do we have to tear them all down and start from scratch?
Yeah, that's a big question, and I know that in a lot of spaces, and I have been attending to, a lot of fantastic panels. I know that various organizations, that are taking place, that are, taking part in this summit today are asking that question. For me personally, I do feel like it's a little bit of both, right? I think that at the end of the day, I think what I've learned is that, to really have any significant change happen, you really need a network, right? And you need you need an informal network, and you need an official network. And I think that, we can all play different roles, and whether you're sort of, trying to, push the line inside an institution or an organization, whether you are disrupting, right, and advocating from outside, I feel like there's real value. I feel like in terms of, whether, we need to sort of, as you say, sort of burn it all down versus trying to, make change to organizations that exist today, I do feel like it is really context specific. I think that there are definitely spaces that are, I think, incredibly valuable and, would be really, really enriched, right, by, the diversity that's inevitable, and really renewing these organizations, right? I think there are perhaps other organizations, maybe they no longer serve the function, or they no longer reflect our current climate and should really be reviewed. So I do feel like it is, it's a little bit of both. One of the things I will just say, though, I think because that has been, my career for many, many years, is that, when you are, part of a racialized community, or, coming from, a very sort of specific diaspora, etc., being inside a institution can also be incredibly stressful, and there are, other folks that I share that with, where we sometimes talk about that and say, we almost need a network just to support ourselves, right? Because I think it's recognizing that, that's a very particular space to also hold. And I do still believe it's an important space to hold, but it can be incredibly difficult, and sometimes it's not always clear what is the right thing to do, and I think that, you try to make the best decisions at that time, and you try to, I think, hold on to a moral center as best as possible. I don't think you always succeed. Sometimes you fail, very, very badly, but I do feel like, yeah, I think, it's, I have a lot of, I also have a lot of empathy for folks in that situation.
Well, then let's talk about TIFF. That's, well, like, because you came into TIFF at a very interesting time. This is like, like after the festival had dealt with like kind of basically the pandemic. You entered right before the 2022 festival. This is the moment where it's like rebounding after two kind of virtual fests or half virtual fests. So I can't imagine it was easy to jump in at that moment during this moment of upheaval, not just for the film festival, but for the film industry in general. Yes. So yeah, talk to me about like what was the most kind of challenging aspect of that?
Yeah, I mean, It's been, definitely interesting a couple of years. As you said, I started right after the 2 COVID years. So in many ways, the 2 editions prior had been largely digital. And so in many ways, there had been things that had been paused or dismantled. There had been a little bit of a shift. And of course, significant structural change in the leadership. And of course, Cameron Bailey beginning his sort of position as CEO as well. And that was really, one of the big appeals for me in terms of joining TIFF at the time that I did. And so it really was a year of rebuilding in many ways. And I think having a lot of conversations around, what does TIFF want to be moving forward? What does that vision look like? What are sort of the priorities that we wanted to set moving forward? And, as we did that work, we just had no idea what was coming. I sort of had an incredible first festival, but at that first festival, in many ways was a learning festival for me. And after that festival, I really sort of dug up my sleeves and, did a lot of what I thought were sort of building for the next festival. And then, of course, the strike hit. Right? And I noticed there was a strike panel happening just before I came here, and I sat in for 5 minutes and I started to get like post-traumatic stress, so I had to walk out, right? And the strike was really, really difficult because it really meant that week by week, we suddenly did not know, what the landscape was going to be. So many things that we would just take for granted would happen. We could not take for granted. I feel like literally at some point we had a conversation with every single stakeholder, right? And not even a clear-cut conversation, but what is going to happen? And, would they be eligible for an agreement? Are they going to get an agreement? I mean, it was just, right, the space.
I was nipping at your butts the whole time. Like, what's going on?
Yes, yeah. And, at the end of the day, what's funny is that we had an incredible festival. And I'll just share something that I'm very proud of, which is that our attendance this past festival was actually higher than the previous one. Yes, and actually our tickets sold were actually higher this festival than the previous one. So ironically, I think what it really showed is that Toronto audiences, at the end of the day, are really excited about the films, really excited about, the filmmakers, the Q&As. Absolutely, the stars are important, and absolutely they're the icing on the cake. But that, they're really, we really are a city of cinephiles, and I think it really showed up in this festival. I also feel like we were able to, in some ways, platform both Canadian and international, non-US films and filmmakers and stars, perhaps in a larger way than we may have been able to in an ordinary year. And we also really felt there were some, clear wins that came out of that as well. So yeah, I think it was a mixed blessing, but definitely it was a struggle to get there. But at the end, we were very, very happy with the results.
Well, I mean, that's amazing. I didn't realize about those numbers. I wanted to go back to something you said about trying to hang on to morality within institutions and stuff, right? Because even when you talk about kind of festival programming, this kind of comes up, and I'm sure Reelworld has to deal with it too. When you're a festival that makes a statement that you are going to try and achieve parity, you're taking a principled stance, right? When you're a festival that prides itself on pushing diversity, you're taking a principled stance. And I think there's also an invisible hand in terms of programming, where sometimes the programming can be shaped by morality, where maybe we don't want to be associated with this toxic filmmaker, maybe we don't want to be associated with this toxic content. There was a lot of conversation about, say, like Venice programming Roman Polanski's films, things like that, right? And a lot of people will criticize TIFF or any other film festival that makes that kind of moral judgment call, saying that it's not the place of a festival to delineate in that way. I disagree, because I think programming is shaping and it's curating, and the toxic people can find their space wherever else they want to find their space. That's just me. But I want to know, how do you feel about that? Even just the criticism towards that kind of shaping hand?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question, and I see that this question has actually become much more relevant, and it's becoming much more complex. And so, just to very reductive. For example, we have something that, internally we just call a hot list, right? And so the programming team that works with me will just, identify and say, potentially, a film that we might want to, put on the hot list. And all that means is not at all that we're not going to program it, but that we appreciate that there are some aspects to the film that may be controversial or problematic for certain communities. And it's definitely not an easy answer. I think, coming out of also movements like Me Too and such, I think that specifically also in Hollywood, right? And in the film industry, I think there's much greater awareness of where does that line, right? Between an artist and, their work, right? Versus their behavior, right? And as any kind of cultural institution, and specifically as a programming one, what you are doing is giving this artist a very big platform, right? And so it is really hard not to ask that question if it is somebody who perhaps is very clearly crossing certain lines, ethically, morally, criminally, in the real world. What does that mean, in terms of, institutions where we have the power to give this individual a platform or not? So definitely I think it's become a much more complex question, not only for us. I think at the end of the day, though, I feel like context again and our social values as a society is really what becomes the criteria that we're looking at. And I'll just give you an example. As part of TIFF, we're part of a larger organization called FIAF, and it's essentially, other sort of big film festivals around the world. I joke about it and I call it sort of like a film festival UN, right? But we're this kind of organization, and, at major festivals, we get together and meet and sort of share experiences and talk about, if there are any sort of value statements or, whatnot that we can put out together. At this meeting will be, the artistic director of Venice, the artistic director of Berlin, the artistic director of Busan. And what becomes really, really evident is that we are also shaped by our specific cultural spaces, the societies that we're located in. And you also realize, the whole kind of value space is ever evolving. And so, in a particular continent, a particular discussion may not have even begun, for example, right? Whereas, a particular kind of value discussion, let's say for us here in Canada or North America, has really progressed to a very different space, And so it's always interesting having those discussions and actually also seeing it's difficult even for us as film festivals internationally, to be able to come out with a very clear, strong value position, and so, and so I think, again, not right now, the fact that I'm not able to give a clear answer, I think is just reflective of how I think complex this space is. But absolutely, I think, as film festivals and cultural institutions, I think this is just becoming, something that we do really have to look at, and it is very much part of what we do.
Well, I mean, first of all, I didn't know that there was a UN of film festivals, and I think the clear answer is that Cannes opened with the Johnny Depp movie. But, so there's a contrast there. But I mean, you know what? I feel like remiss that I didn't even mention that you received Reelworld's Visionary Award this year. So congratulations to you on that.
Thank you.
That's like, and the whole reason why we're talking here. So, speaking of visionary, like, what is the vision for TIFF going forward as you are navigating kind of just all of these big shifts? Like, what do you see like as the big challenges and how you in your way forward through those?
Mm-hmm. That's a huge question, and certainly, something that, I think we're having a lot of discussions as an overall leadership team. You know, I think that I think for us right now, coming out of the strike, and I think also 2 previous years of COVID, I think there is still a sense of we are trying to build back up, you know, to a place where the festival can be as sustainable and as robust moving forward. So definitely, I think our overall health as an organization right now is a priority for us. But, you know, I think that we are really, I think, looking at the industry at large and looking at, you know, where is the industry growing, right? Where are there some really interesting filmmakers and a filmmaking, you know, industry that is evolving? And I think what, especially for me on the programming side, I think that, you know, looking at certain parts of the world that I think will really be important for TIFF moving forward. You know, I'm a little bit subjective, of course, being of, you know, South Korean ancestry, but, you know, South Korea, for example, a huge industry and, you know, content from South Korea. I think both film and series, as you see, becoming really, really popular, you know, across internationally, right? Not just in Asia or South Korea. So, you know, that's an example where more recently, you know, I've been really just, you know, focusing on also building those relationships, you know, with parts of the world where I think that really makes sense for TIFF as an organization. And then also, I think that, you know, understanding that Hollywood and celebrities and that part of the film festival is hugely important for TIFF and for TIFF's livelihood. But that, you know, TIFF has a strong legacy of very strong international programming, you know, and we also have multiple sections in the festival that sometimes not everybody realizes. You know, we have a discovery section for first and second films. You know, we have a world cinema program we recently renamed Centerpiece, which really shows largely independent art house films from around the world. You know, I'm focusing on our platform section, which is a smaller competitive section that I'm hoping to grow. And so I think it's really the overall ecology of the programming that we do. And for me, I'm really invested in really trying to both strategically position and I think continue to grow the significance of all of those programs and sections within TIFF.
Okay, amazing. I guess, like, looking back, if out of all the movies you produced, is there one that you are the most proud of and why? If you had to pick one on the spot.
You know, I'm so proud of so many of the films that I did. So, you know, maybe it's not accurate to say it's the one that I'm the most proud of. But if I could say, you know, I think that one that was very close to my heart, I would say it was The Apology, which is the film about Korean comfort women by Tiffany Chung. It was a film that took us maybe about 4 years to complete because these are elderly grandmothers, the last survivors of comfort women who are sexual survivors in South Korea. And I think, you know, the journey of telling their stories and that film ended up going to the UN at that time, presented at the UN. You know, there hasn't yet been perhaps a formal apology, and there's a little bit of a debate in that, but I do really feel like that film played a significant role in really highlighting that story. And I was able to meet a few of those grandmothers, which was an incredible, incredible experience. And, when we talk about, resilience, right? And you meet these women, almost 90 years old who have gone through what they have gone through and still fighting, for an apology and fighting for their stories to be told. It's something that I would never forget. And that film also did very, very well. We did an interactive version of it also called The Space We Hold. And we received a Peabody Award for both the interactive project and the feature film. And so in many ways, that just was a very meaningful film for me.
Well, congratulations on that and everything you've achieved.